Mid-Central Transport. As always, Matthew pulled in the lot and parked as far away as possible from all other vehicles. He climbed out and began crossing the yard. He could see a group of paramedics loading a gurney into the ambulance. There was a body on it, but it was covered from head to foot with a blanket. As he approached the scene, Jim Bob Murphy stepped out from behind a fire truck. "Hey, man," he said. His accent suggested Appalachia. "Hey, Jim Bob, what's going on here?" said Matthew. "Dead man in the yard this morning. Found him lying there." "Who found him, you?" "Yup," said Jim Bob. "He's just laying there, not breathing or nothing. Not a mark on him. No blood or nothing." Jim Bob was not his real name. The birth certificate issued him at Cook County Hospital stated his name was James Michael Murphy. Everyone assumed he was from down south, but Jim Bob had grown up in Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood. 16 years in the U.S. Army had given Jim Bob great skill as a truck mechanic and a southern accent. Whether it was South Vietnam, Fort Hood, Texas, or even Alaska, Jim Bob had been surrounded by Southerners. Eventually he acquired their accent. The appellation Bob was added upon his return to Illinois. It had been intended as a slight, but Jim Bob embraced it. He thought it sounded good. Some of his co-workers suggested Jim Bob couldn't count to 11 without removing one of his shoes. That was an exaggeration. Though limited in many ways, Jim Bob knew trucks. He could repair an air brake assembly faster and better than anyone. He could listen to trucks idling and pick out the Caterpillar, the Volvo, and the Cummins engines while blindfolded. Unfortunately, conversations with Jim Bob could be tortured. They often resembled dialogue from the Beverly Hillbillies or Green Acres. Today, Matthew did not want to play the part of Mr. Drysdale or Oliver Wendell Douglas. He nodded and moved towards the office door. The office and warehouse were typical structures for Elk Grove Village. The community was home to the largest business park in America. Over 3,800 businesses were located in the area adjacent to O'Hare International Airport. The noise from the airport was incessant. Although residents complained constantly about airport noise, many were actually distressed when the airport fell silent for a few days after 9/11. There was no uncombusted jet fuel in the air, and the runways were quiet. An eerie calm caused many of the locals to re-examine their disdain for the airport. Mid-Central's location consisted of a one-story brick office that was attached to a warehouse with 10 truck bays. It had an 8-foot chain-link fence with 3 strands of barbed wire at the top that enclosed the perimeter of the truck yard and property. Matthew entered the office quickly, passing through the outer office vestibule and into the office proper. He saw that no one was in their usual place, so he followed the sounds of voices to the back office meeting room. It was the room usually reserved for driver safety meetings, but today the conference table was surrounded by Mike Mathers, Mid-Central's owner, his wife Tony, Carla, the VP of Finance, and 2 members of law enforcement. Dave Kramer was a sergeant with the Elk Grove Village Police, and Sebastian Pinsky was a Cook County Sheriff's deputy. By a quirk of geography, Mid-Central's property was on a line that separated Elk Grove Village from unincorporated Cook County. For now, both jurisdictions would be involved in the investigation. Mike Mather stood up. "This is our insurance agent, Matthew Pendleton. He's also our safety consultant." Matthew shook hands with both officers who barely looked at him. He sat down and pulled out a yellow legal pad. He had many questions, but thought it prudent to merely listen for now and hoped that his questions would be answered in due course. Sergeant Kramer continued with his questions. "Jim Bob said he found the body about 4:45 a.m. Is it usual for him to arrive that early?" "Yes," said Mike. "Usually, but not always. He doesn't have exact hours. It depends on the workload." "And was it usual for Dmitri Charnowski to be here that early?" asked Sergeant Kramer. "Dmitri," thought Matthew. "That answers my first question." Mike began again. "Dmitri pulled a load of farm equipment from a manufacturer in Waterloo, Iowa yesterday and dropped it at the rail yard. He was returning his trailer to the yard." "What time did he get here?" asked Sergeant Kramer. "We don't know," said Mike. "He never clocked out and no one else was working then, so we don't really have any way of knowing." "I see several security cameras out there. We'll need the video," said Kramer. "Do you keep it on a hard drive or do you use a tape system?" Well, that's a problem. You see, the cameras weren't working properly. We've had problems with the service company. They screwed up the billing, and now they won't even repair the equipment, said Mike uncomfortably. Actually, the dispute centered on a temper tantrum Mike had had with the service company over truck damage to the cameras. Mid-Central drivers ran into everything in sight, including the telephone poles that the security cameras were mounted on. Mike thought CMS, the security company, should fix the cameras at no cost. They didn't see it that way. How long has it been that way? Asked Deputy Pinsky. About a year, I guess. I don't know. It's not something I take care of, retorted Mike. He was getting testy. Both Kramer and Pinsky looked up from their notes. They held each person in the room in their gaze for a long moment to achieve maximum discomfort. It was a cop thing. Are you aware that because the U.S. Department of Transportation has granted you hazardous material licenses, that you are required to maintain constant video surveillance of your yard? The only person in the room that was amused was Matthew, although he hid it well. He had begged Mike and Tony to get the cameras fixed, but they ignored him. He also knew that the requirement the cops were referring to was one from the U.S. Department of Transportation. It was federal law. Pinsky and Kramer had no authority over the matter. Cop games, thought Matthew. For a moment, Tony thought about trying to lay the blame on Matthew. After all, wasn't he the safety consultant? Then she remembered the many emails he had sent her advising her to settle their differences with CMS and get the cameras fixed. He had copied everyone. Mike glanced around the room for someone to save him from the awkward silence. Tony finally spoke. We were planning to have them fixed, but we've been so busy that we just haven't had the chance. She had been looking alternatively out the window at her new BMW X5 and examining her nails. Up till now she had been bored, but now she was becoming annoyed. Besides, Dimitri wasn't even one of our drivers, she said. Carla and Matthew looked at each other and exchanged the same thought. Bird brain. What does that mean exactly? Asked Kramer. He and Pinsky looked at Mike, then at Tony. Mike began haltingly. What it means is that he drives for us, but he's not ours. Mike stammered and stopped. If I may, said Matthew, stepping in much to Mike's relief. Dmitry Charnowski was an owner-operator. Essentially, he owned and maintained his own truck. He leased his equipment and his services as driver to Mid-Central on a formal but temporary basis. Basically, he was an independent contractor, not an employee driver. He was free to lease his services to any trucking company, in this case Mid-Central. Consistent with state and federal law, he operated his own equipment, his own driver logs, and his own insurance, although he was under Midwest coverage when he was driving for them. Tony has copy of his driver's contract, and my office maintains copies of his insurance certificates and ICC filings. Tony stood up. I'll get copies of his contract. As she headed out of the office, Matthew looked around the room and said, Perhaps someone could get me up to speed here. I'm playing catch-up on this. Pinsky and Kramer shifted in their chairs but said nothing. Mike studied the floor. Finally, Carla spoke. Dimitri had a pickup in Waterloo. I think it was tractor parts. Anyway, he was unloaded in North Lake, and their records indicate that he pulled out of their yard about midnight. The next thing we know for sure is that Jim Bob came in this morning and found him lying in the yard dead. He had dropped his trailer in the back and pulled his tractor to the front gate as if he was about to leave. Jim Bob said the cab door was open and the truck was running. He called 911. That's it, she shrugged. Matthew nodded and turned to Kramer and Pinsky. Any injuries or signs of violence? It's under investigation, said Pinsky without emotion. More cop games, thought Matthew. Look, he said, I'm not asking you for any inside information, and anything that you share will be kept in the strictest confidence. I just need to know what steps, if any, need to be taken. As I said, it's under investigation, repeated Pinsky. I see, said Matthew. Thank you, you've been helpful. His tone did not betray his sarcastic mood. Turning to Carla, can you give me updated toll, time, and IFTA info from Dimitri's truck? There may be something useful there. And the record of his stops. I'll call my office and have his updated credit report run this morning. There might be something useful in that as well. The office was silent except for the sound of Tony running copies of the driver's contracts. and then the sound of her voice. "Fuck, I broke a nail." Mike winced, but no one else moved except for Carla, who smiled only slightly. Matthew studied the office floor. The office had a dark track on it from oil and grease, tracked in from the warehouse and repair shop. The office smelled of diesel. Kramer and Pinsky studied him. "What's IFTA, and what can you deduce from it? And what about the credit report? You can't do that, can you?" said Kramer. "Sure I can. We write the cargo insurance for Mid-Central, and they haul some high-value products. By both state and federal law, we are permitted to pull the financial information on anyone in this operation anytime we want. In insurance, we have access to all kinds of information, more than you might think. As for IFTA, it stands for International Fuel Tax Association. It can provide a great deal of information about Dimitri's movements, but it's kind of a long story. It would take a while to explain. Besides, you have your investigation, I have mine. You know by law you're required to provide any pertinent information related to a criminal inquiry," said Pinsky, trying to recover quickly. "Oh, I'll give you all the information you want. I have a mountain of information." Matthew paused. "Good luck figuring it out. It only took me 15 years to get a handle on it. You're a smart guy. Maybe you'll be faster." Tension filled the room. Mike and Carla wished they could leave. Matthew's nostrils flared. "What's with the attitude?" said Kramer, unsure whether to escalate the situation or shift to a good cop mode. "Look," said Matthew, "I ask a simple question to determine if my client needs to put on additional security, or if we have an internal employee violence situation. We have employees from a number of different countries like Bosnia and Serbia that hold 500-year-old grudges. I'm just trying to do my job, but you guys are giving me it's under investigation. Cooperation is a two-way street. How about a little professional courtesy?" Kramer adopted a pensive expression. He had been duly chastised. He nodded and slowly said, "You can begin by fixing those cameras." The discussion was interrupted by Tony's return. She handed copies to everyone, including Matthew, Mike, and Carla, none of whom really needed one. Matthew saw it was coming. It was the Tony Show, in which Tony would hold forth on all her contributions to the organization. In fact, her contributions were quite meager, but she would explain them in a way that sounded brilliant and heroic. In reality, her husband had only given her an office, a title, and some duties as a means to keep her out of the mall. She had a capacity for dropping a great deal of money in a short time at the shops at Woodfield. Matthew also suspected it was intended to prevent Tony from engaging in extracurricular activities with the occasional personal trainer, golf instructor, or tennis coach, male or female. Some of Mike's suspicions were merely psychological projections of his own bad thoughts and behavior. The truck drivers joked that he would jump on any woman who could outrun him. Carla had fought to keep him at arm's length for years. In pursuit of sexual conquest, Mike would take incredible risks. He had once gotten a quickie from a cleaning service woman at his home in an upstairs bathroom while Tony was laying by the pool. The driver's nickname for him was Horn Dog. In short, Mike and Tony were perfect for one another. They were united by the same low morals and lack of restraint. Tony held the floor and stated the obvious. "This is a driver's contract." The top of the sheet said in bold letters, "Driver's contract." "I wrote this," said Tony, "to clearly define the roles of owner-operators." Actually, the contract had been given to her by Matthew to replace the one she had copied and pasted from the internet. The old one had been woefully inadequate and would not pass muster in court with the IRS or the Illinois Department of Employment Security. It was typical Tony. She continued, "I keep all personal files, safety records, and all the required fuel. That's not important," shouted Mike. He had seen the show many times and was in no mood to see it again. Tony ignored him. "As I was saying," she turned for a moment to glare at Mike, "I made several calls about the cameras, but we've been so busy and so overworked that we probably won't get it done until we return from Florida." Mike and Tony had a place in St. Petersburg. They had been there 6 times that year for a week each time. As for being overworked, her work pattern could best be described as part-time. She rarely arrived before 10 and usually left not long after 2. Tony pushed as much work as she could off on Carla or other office staff, and then took credit for everything they did. Carla and Matthew looked at each other again. Bird brain, they thought, and nodded. Matthew stood up. Thanks, Tony. I'm going to go outside and take some pictures. You're not leaving yet, are you? Asked Mike quickly with some hint of desperation. No, said Matthew. I just want to get a few pictures and look around. Depending on the evidence in the medical examiner's report, this could be a crime, a liability claim, and a workers' compensation death claim. Once the lawyers get hold of it, maybe all three, and more. Tony jumped up. Well, we're not going to be on the hook for this, she said hotly. He was old and probably just keeled over. Matthew winced. Dimitri was 50, Matthew's age. He looked at her and smiled, which he interpreted as an agreement, and felt vindicated. His thoughts were otherwise. At 44, she was still attractive, although excessive tanning was beginning to take its toll. Where will you be at 50, Matthew thought to himself. Pirates Bay, I hope. Carla was looking at Matthew intently, as if trying to read his thoughts. Mike was too.